The practice didn't die in a courtroom or under the flash of cameras. It died when the earth gave up what people tried to hide in it. On an ordinary October afternoon in 1892, two labourers in Sydney dug through a backyard to lay a service pipe and struck something the sun couldn't to bleach and time couldn't to smother. At first it looked like cloth trapped in hard soil. Then the shape resolved into something unmistakable. The remains of a child, no more than a few months old, resting in a shallow grave barely deeper than the spade that revealed it. No one screamed. The men did what men sometimes do when confronted with the unspeakable. They covered it back over, as if a few inches of dirt could bury the shock long enough to find words. By morning they had found a second little body not far from the first. When the police arrived, Senior Constable James Joyce paced the yard, following the story in the soil, recent disturbances, the pattern of spadework, the way the ground had settled unevenly, in a line that suggested more than a single interment. The tenants shaken had only moved in weeks earlier. Whoever had been here before had left more than unpaid rent and old newspapers. They had left proof of a trade that didn't have a storefront, a trade that thrived precisely because it lived behind curtains and beneath floors, baby farming. If the phrase sounds like a rumor from a feverish moral panic, understand that it had structure. In late 19th century Australia, like in Britain and parts of the United States, advertisements offered adoption or care with no questions asked. A fee changed hands, a baby left a desperate mother's arms, a promise floated between strangers. The child will be loved, fed, raised. Sometimes that promise was real. Often it was a business model that counted on quiet deaths. Malnutrition could be called failure to thrive. Disease, especially congenital syphilis, carried its own ready alibi. A fever here, a cough there, no one asked why a funeral came without a birth certificate. In Sydney, one couple would become the face of that hidden industry. John and Sarah Makin. They were not movie villains, they were not shadowy masterminds, they were ordinary, perhaps the most frightening detail of all. John, a delivery driver off and on, a man who wore his boasts like a coat despite how thin his pockets were. Sarah, a midwife by trade, practiced in the art of reassuring hands and soft-spoken confidence. Between them, they raised a large family and moved frequently, never giving neighbours long enough to learn the rhythm of the household before the wagon creaked away to a new street and a new story. After the first two bodies surfaced at Burren Street, police followed the trail of addresses the couple had shed over the prior months. At one former residence, the soil appeared recently disturbed, but the hole was empty. Had someone returned to remove what lay beneath? A grim scavenger hunt began, moving from Redfern to MacDonaldtown and beyond, each small backyard holding its breath. The press took it up in a heartbeat, and a city that had tolerated whispers suddenly faced headlines. The term baby farm hardened from gossip into a proper noun, an institution hiding in plain sight, but the horror of a system is always clearest in the lives it touches. A teenager named Agnes had advertised for a kind woman to adopt her little boy. She met a couple who claimed they had recently lost a child and could offer a proper home. £5 changed hands. A promise was made about a new address, a farm, a future. She never saw her son again. Another mother, Clara, offered a premium if someone would raise her infant daughter. She visited the house once more after handing the child over and found only emptiness. The rooms emptied of furniture and memory with equal efficiency. Amber, even younger, placed an advertisement for her newborn, Horace. She met the couple, signed the papers, and tried to believe she had done the right thing. Weeks later, the city would learn a new meaning for relocation. What began as a single trench for a pipe widened into an excavation of conscience. Within days, the tally rose, 3, 5, more, each small bundle a ledger entry in a business that made its margin by starving both bodies and scrutiny. And yet, even with bodies in the ground, the question that would haunt investigators and a jury remained the same. Can you prove murder where the method leaves no wound, the motive is money, and the witnesses are children who cannot speak? To understand why such a trade could flourish, we have to step into the city as it was. Sydney in the 1880s and early 1890s carried all the signatures of a growing colonial metropolis, industry expanding, neighbourhoods densifying, poverty elbowing prosperity on the same blocks. Respectability mattered. An unwed mother wore her mistake publicly, while the father often disappeared into anonymity. Workhouses, lying-in homes and informal midwives formed a patchwork safety net with more holes than rope. Legal oversight lagged. Registration systems were inconsistent. Death certificates for infants were not scrutinized the way adult fatalities might be. Baby farmers filled that gap with a proposition brutally simple. For £3 to £5, sometimes more, sometimes less, they would remove the stigma, solve a problem, offer a story a family could tell itself. The newspapers abetted the market. Classifieds ran like a river of need and solution, the same column inches that sold umbrellas and new boots now offering a good home to an unnamed baby, if only the mother would be discreet. In the absence of consistent state involvement, private arrangements proliferated. Some caregivers were sincere and struggled honestly. Others discovered that neglect was cheaper than nurture. John and Sarah exploited the grey zones expertly. Sarah's experience as a midwife lent her credibility among terrified young women who had nowhere else to turn. John played the role of the steady husband with a plan. There was always talk of a farm, of an inheritance, of a move just around the corner that explained why addresses kept changing. They used aliases in correspondence. They met mothers in neutral places, a midwife's rooms, a boarding house parlor, spaces that looked official enough to soothe, informal enough to avoid creating a paper trail. The stories of individual mothers, when later stitched together by police, reveal the pattern like a watermark. A letter signed by E. Hill here, a promise to send the new address there. A visit rebuffed with "she is out walking the child," followed by an empty dwelling the next day. Clothing that a mother remembered packing on her infant. Tiny shirts, a bonnet, a blanket, surfacing later in a bundle exhumed from a yard. Always the same undertone. You're doing the right thing. We'll raise the child as our own. You can't provide what we can. It is impossible to read these accounts and not feel the trap close twice, first around the mother, then around the child. As the investigation widened, Senior Constable Joyce emerged as the steady figure pushing past rumour toward proof. He visited every address the Makins had occupied. He made notes on disturbed soil, on which neighbours had seen which pram, which parcel, which late-night digging. He talked to the mothers who answered the advertisements. He listened for the continuity inside the variations, because prosecution in such a case would live or die on patterns. A single death could be misfortune. A dozen had to be intent. Even so, the legal problem was monstrous. The little bodies were often too decomposed to yield a cause of death. Malnutrition leaves no signature a coroner can reliably call murder when months have passed. If a child had been born with disease, a defense attorney could float natural causes and look for jurors who needed certainty, not inference. That is how baby farmers elsewhere had slipped through, by leaning on the very invisibility society had granted these children from the start. Meanwhile, Sydney itself performed the other half of the cycle. Outrage. Newspapers printed illustrations and long columns of moral fury. Crowds gathered as police dug in yards, as if witnessing the exhumations could claw back some of what had been taken. Editorials demanded that lawmakers close the gaps through which these transactions flowed. The word mercy changed meanings. Once applied to the women seeking relief, it now turned toward the dead. By mid-November 1892, the body count associated with addresses the Makins had occupied reached numbers that shook even hardened officers, 15 and counting. Among the recovered items, a few scraps stood out. Clothing a mother could name, a mark on a garment, a letter with an alias linked to a familiar hand. One case offered a chance at something the Crown could present as more than a chain of suggestion. The little boy named Horace. His mother, Amber, could testify to handing him to the couple. Clothing she recognized was found with remains recovered from a property they had left. To a prosecutor, that combination of custody and discovery was as close to a straight line as the case would ever offer, and so the matter shifted from the noise of excavation to the silence of the courtroom, where the dead would speak only through inference, and the living would be measured for credibility on a scale that never quite accounts for grief. The trial of John and Sarah opened in March 1893. They were seated together, but their performances diverged. John stony and contained, Sarah in handkerchiefs and heavy sighs. You can read it as strategy or as temperament. Juries read it as character. The Crown ES challenge was clear. Show that Horace died in their care and that his death was no accident. First came the chain of custody. Amber describing how she placed an advertisement, met a couple who seemed kind, paid a fee, signed what papers she was told to sign, and handed over her baby in the good faith of a young woman drowning in limited options. Then the material evidence. Articles of clothing recovered with a small body found at a former Makin residence. Articles Amber recognized as the ones Horace wore when she said goodbye. In a case where facts eroded in soil and time, cloth held memory with unusual fidelity. Constable Joyce testified to the searches, the places where earth had recently been turned, the addresses that lined up with the couple's rentals. He described blood staining beneath the armpits of some garments, as if an instrument might have pierced toward the heart from a hidden angle. It was a theory, an argument for deliberateness that left minimal marks. No doctor could state it as a cause of death, but the jurors heard, perhaps for the first time, a plausible method that explained how so many infants might be killed without attracting attention or leaving traceable trauma. In a courtroom, the defense doesn't need to win the story, only to fracture it. The Makin's attorney pointed at decomposition, at disease, at the statistically high infant mortality of the era, at the absence of a smoking gun. He argued that the prosecution asked the jury to convict on disgust rather than proof. He suggested that a baby could die of natural causes in anyone's care, and that burying a child, though secretive and illegal, didn't by itself constitute murder. This last argument, almost obscene when spoken aloud, highlights the odd legal territory of the time, where the lines between neglect, concealment, and homicide blurred in ways that clever defendants could exploit. The Crown leaned on pattern. One child might die tragically. 15 mapped across a single couple's rentals made tragedy look like a business plan. They leaned on lies, the aliases in letters, the false promises of farms and inheritances, the evasions when mothers returned unannounced. They leaned on the charged simplicity that evil sometimes prefers. Money taken, mouths unfed, dirt used as bookkeeping. After 3 days, the prosecution rested without dramatic flourish. There were no confessions, no eyewitnesses to a crime that always took place out of sight. The defense declined to call witnesses. When the jury retired, they didn't take long. They returned with guilty verdicts for both John and Sarah in Horace's murder. Yet even in that moment, the jury carved an exception. They recommended mercy for Sarah. Whether that was a response to her demeanor or to a broader belief about a wife as agency under a husband's control, or to the era's reflex to empathize more readily with a woman as performance of grief, is impossible to say. The judge sentenced both to death but promised to pass the recommendation forward. Appeals followed the grooves they always do. The defense argued that the judge allowed prejudicial evidence, namely references to other bodies, turning one prosecutable case into a referendum on a dozen. Higher courts were unmoved. The sheer weight of the circumstantial record, they said, supported the verdict. The colonial government commuted Sarah's sentence to life in prison. John's remained death. On the morning of his execution in August 1893, witnesses described his bearing as impassive. He left letters insisting on his innocence and addressing his children with a tenderness he had never shown the infants entrusted to him. The courtroom drama closed one chapter, but not the book. While the city exhaled, lawmakers began to consider how many levers had to fail for a couple like the Makins to prosper. Legal systems don't learn quickly. They learn in grief's language, numbers, names, and the record of who was present and who was not. The Makin case was sensational, but it was not unprecedented. In Britain, names like Amelia Dyer were already cautionary tales, women who turned adoption ads into conveyor belts toward unmarked graves. In each place, the pattern depended on similar conditions: stigma around illegitimacy, thin public assistance, lax regulation on infant care and private adoptions, inconsistent birth and death registrations. If you wanted to design a society where baby farming could exist, you would start with shame and add poverty, then subtract oversight. Reform came piecemeal. In Australia, the shock of 1892–1893 added fuel to movements already pressing for better registration of births and deaths, for scrutiny of private nursing homes that took infants for money, for licensing schemes that would at least place such homes on a ledger the state could inspect. Newspaper campaigns advocated for what we might now call child protection frameworks, laws that convert a moral intuition, someone should check on those babies, into enforceable obligations. When registration improved, concealment became harder. When oversight expanded, the worst actors either adapted or exited. It's tempting to chalk the entire phenomenon up to monstrous individuals. Certainly the Makins made 1,000 choices that carried them from need into cruelty. But the structure matters. Every advertisement a mother posted was a message in a bottle, cast into currents formed by policy and prejudice. In a culture where an unwed pregnancy meant social death, a kind lady offering a home for a small fee could look like rescue. In a legal environment where infants who died were less likely to trigger inquiry, a balance sheet could quietly reclassify food and warmth as optional expenses. The press deserves an ambiguous place in this story. They helped create the market by providing the classifieds that connected desperate women with predatory caregivers. They helped demolish it by treating the Makins' yards as crime scenes writ large, forcing the public and legislators to look. Moral panic produces bad policy as often as good. In this case, outrage helped align common sense with law. Infants are not a commodity. Secrecy in their adoption is an invitation to abuse. And what of Sarah after the judge's commutation? Prison records transform flesh into entries, hospital attendant by 1898, growing health problems, daughters petitioning for release. A new government eventually discharged her into a daughter's care in 1911. She lived until 1918, long enough for the world outside to witness a war that dwarfed private tragedies in scale, but not perhaps in intimacy. In death notices, causes like senile decay and heart failure reduce life to a Mechanic S report. History does not record remorse in her hand. It rarely does for anyone. The practical legacy of the case is clearer than the moral one. Greater oversight, stricter licensing in childcare, vigilant registration of infant deaths. These are the tools that make certain money cannot be minted from the lives of those who cannot speak. When those tools dull, other versions of baby farming reappear under different euphemisms: unregulated rehoming, fraudulent adoptions, for-profit orphanages that starve. The specifics change, the arithmetic doesn't. We often remember crimes because they produce spectacle, a lurid detail, a sensational trial, a name easy to pronounce and hard to forget. The Australian baby farm forces a different kind of memory, one built from absences. No first birthdays, no school photographs, no mispronounced words at the kitchen table. The people at the centre were ordinary enough that you could pass them in the street and never turn your head. The victims were so young that their lives fit inside blankets someone else chose. If there's a lesson, it isn't only be vigilant. It's that the spaces society designates as private, homes, nurseries, informal agreements, must sometimes be made legible to the law when power runs only one way. Child welfare is a public matter, not because the state should sit at every cradle, but because the vulnerable vanish most easily where there are no witnesses. The Makins didn't invent that invisibility. They used it. We can also resist the comforting fable that everything has improved because we are modern. Yes, regulation and registration have changed the landscape. Yes, shame no longer carries the same legal penalties it once did. But the temptation to outsource care remains. The temptation to look away persists. Whenever a system prices dignity beyond the reach of the poor, someone will find a market for shortcuts. A century later, Sydney is a different city, yet the October sun can still feel warm on a worker's neck. A spade can still catch on what the ground was not meant to hold. And the moral remains stubborn. Any society is measured by what it asks of those with the least power and how it protects those who can not yet speak. The victims in this story can't tell us what they suffered. The world they lived in spoke for them, first by failing them, then belatedly by changing because of them. If you found yourself unsettled by this story, that's appropriate. It is, above all, a chapter about what people do when no one is watching, and how sometimes the only witness left is the soil.